everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. We have our good friend Gregg Henriques here today. Gregg is an American psychologist, a life philosopher, and a professor at James Madison University. He's also the creator of the Unified Theory of Knowledge, which is a unified vision of science, psychology, and philosophy. And he was a previous sense maker in residence here at the Stoa on the Unified Theory of Knowledge. And today we're going to talk about something that Gregg has probably recently discovered in his system about a year ago, I would say, called wisdom energy. And it's almost like the telos of this whole unified theory of knowledge, which is quite cool. So we're going to discover what wisdom energy is today and dig deep into the concept. So yeah, and me and Gregg will jam a bit, but if you have any questions anytime, we'll get some voices in relatively quickly. Just put them in the chat. I'll call on you to mute yourself. You can jump in, ask your question to Gregg. If you don't want to be on YouTube, just indicate that and I'll read your question on your behalf. So Gregg, welcome back to the Stoa, my friend.
Peter, thanks so much for having me here. I always feel the wisdom energy when I get here, man, because you're cultivating such a cool network, and it's always a joy to be here. So deeply appreciate that. And yes, you're right. This concept I stumbled in, actually, I was just looking back at the text that I sent to John Vervaeke, because I text bombed him when I fell into this wisdom energy thing. Actually, it was in October of last year. It's a really interesting kind of emergence. And so basically, I'll give you just a real snapshot of that, and then we can go all sorts of different directions. So the concept came to me when it was spun off of, I'll give just a little bit of background. So the unified theory of knowledge really can be framed by three big picture kinds of ideas. One is the tree of knowledge system. The tree of knowledge system basically maps naturalistic science. It's sort of an updated, better map of big history, if you know what big history is. It orients us to sort of a natural objectivist way of looking at the world, sort of what is from the Big Bang to quantum mechanics and then into biology, then psychology defined as sort of evolution of animals, and then into cultured persons. And that basically is a map of what is, sort of a behavioral map of what is. The garden behind me represents a holistic synthetic philosophy that is certainly grounded on what our best attempts to decide what is, but also then includes the ought, meaning that it includes very clear statements about valued states of being, about how to reflect on those. It's certainly not a comprehensive thing, but it affords a particular way of bridging from a natural science view through psychotherapy, which is originally my professional home. You get into psychotherapy, you deal with all sorts of different value questions about what's wise ways of living, and what are the ways in which we might frame that professionally. How do we think about that holistically? The garden sort of puts the science and therapy, sciences and humanities together and affords a particular invitation for a collective ethos, scientific humanistic philosophy. And so that's another part of the system. And then there's this third part of the system, which is called the coin. The coin, this side of the coin is actually in the form of an H. It's maybe hard to see just in there, but basically that H stands for human identity. What the coin represents is your unique phenomenological perspective through your own epistemological portal into the world. Okay. So what the coin represents is your named perspective. Peter, Gregg, my view on the world, everybody's here. Assuming you're not a zombie, you can relate to the phenomenological place of being in the world, and it represents your unique perspective. So what the tree of knowledge does is give you science. What the garden gives you is a philosophical ought. And what the coin does, the coin affords you a placeholder for unique ideographic subjective phenomenology. And so intersubjective wisdom, ethic, science, and phenomenology are tied together then. Please create some placeholders. It was in October that I happened to be sharing with some people I was at the 4-year, or so it's 3-year anniversary. In October of 2017, I developed what was the thing called the I quad path, which set the stage for the coin. I'm not going to get into all the background technical knowledge that affords that, but I was talking about that and I was sharing that. I also happened to listen to a podcast by Eric Weinstein and Roger Penrose, and they were talking about the nature of the cosmos, and they were talking about this thing called the Riemann Sphere. A Riemann Sphere is a complex unit circle that has, which means it has a real dimension, imaginary dimension, and then it has an infinity dimension on it. And the reason that this is weird, this is maybe a little abstract, I'll get into this. This is just the story. So anyhow, I listened to that, and there's a real, another thing about the coin is that it's in the shape of a unit circle. It's imaginary versus real. That's got meaning. I made a connection between their conversation about the universe and the way many people or many mathematical physical patterns give rise to this Riemann sphere as a particular kind of lens through which you could then see quantum mechanics, general relativity, and the universe, and position the human knower in relationship to that. And that, the intersection of me talking about the coin and that particular relation, that Riemann spherical relation, started a cascade of intersecting blocks in my system that afforded a lineup. Okay, so where essentially what happened was what the unified theory fundamentally is about trying to give a framework so we can get oriented towards what is and what ought to be. Okay, and so the garden then is this ought to be, the tree is what is, and then the coin is your place in relation. Through the Riemann spherical kind of connection, looking back at physics, that jumped an opportunity for a particular vision where I essentially saw the coin mirroring physics through the Riemann sphere. And then I used some of what they were talking about to flip the coin towards what ought to be. Okay, so you rotate the coin to see what is, and then your position, and you get a position on what science is. And then you flip the coin. The backside of the coin, by the way, is the picture of the tree in the garden. And I had a rotate flip event, basically, where all of a sudden my consciousness, the experience, my first person experience of being, created a coordinated harmony between what is all the way back to energy, okay, and then what ought to be all the way up to some wisdom maximized idea. And we can talk about that. But ultimately, the highest ideal of what ought to be can be framed by the concept of wisdom. The most fundamental sort of thing in the universe, and we can decide what I mean by that, can be thought of as energy. Okay, so if you go back like to Big Bang, the idea of matter, time, space actually collapses into, you know, an energy singularity. We can talk about what that would mean, or why some people hate that term, but whatever. It's a way of thinking about the beginning of the universe. And really, I think it is an argument to be made that the most fundamental thing in the universe is energy. I prefer energy information, but anyway. So then, and wisdom is the ultimate ought, the valued states of being that we're sorting for. So essentially what happened is I had a vision for the Riemann sphere orienting by reflecting back into what is, flipping into what ought to be. And when that hit my system a particular way, it created this deep transcendent alignment. And then which I felt as wisdom energy. And it was a really interesting mode for me, because what happened actually is it was many of my sort of heightened alignment times are very rational. I've got a lot of high intellectual energy coming. This one actually dropped off, and it was very, very perspectival, intuitive, and embodied. I just went on walk after walk. I'd somehow get home and just text John some random thing about what the walk revealed. But it was a very, very, I both went down and up simultaneously. I transcended sort of the justificatory dynamic in a particular way. And I felt very connected with the whole of the universe, both at its highest wisdom ideals and its most fundamental grounding in energy. And that coherent integration seemed very profound to me. And it was also really cool because John was like, well, that's actually Qi and Taoism. It's like, oh, you know, who would have thunk it? You know, thousands of years ago, people are honing in on variations of this concept. I plugged it into, you know, Wisdom Energy, A Path to Buddhism as a book, and other people had certainly made that connection. I had never put those two words together quite that way. And that then really basically aligned me, the tree, the coin, and the garden. In other words, I was in right relation with what is, or could be oriented to what ought to be. And that's a snapshot of the concept.
Very cool. Yeah, I really like that. The is associated with the energy, and then the ought associated with wisdom, and then together you get the wisdom energy. And I was wondering if like you could perhaps like speak on the phenomenology of that, how you experience it, and is it something that you are now plugged into kind of all the time, or is it something that you fall in and out of?
Well, certainly I was plugged into it at a particular level at that time that I'm not like in today. I mean, I definitely had a 3-week period or so where my mode of being was moved and went through a bit of a phase shift. I can access it. I was doing some meditative work. I was also working with a friend, Rob Scott, on what he called the fundamental shift, which is basically an old idea about how to get present in the world through what John would call your perspectival knowing, to afford, kind of a pure consciousness event, although not exactly, because I didn't do it through meditation. But the experience of what happened was essentially, as I kept saying, I texted him a couple of times, like it's in my cells. There was a sense of a coherent identification across the various levels of complexification in my body. So it really did feel like I was particularly, my consciousness moved into my cells, down into an embodiment of being. My body felt light. It felt coordinated. It felt freed in a particular kind of way. I also felt very much with a classic sense of sort of expansion and oneness. So I'd be walking my dog Benji around, and I was just like, the sky's beautiful, the trees are beautiful. There's a particular, I am walking God's heaven in a particular way. There was a very sort of expansive sense of energy information flow that was very coordinated, coherent, beautiful, and expansive.
I wonder if like what emerges when I ask this question, if someone doesn't fully grok your system, like if they're just plugging it right now and then a lot of stuff went over their head, how would you define wisdom energy almost independently of the system that it's attached to?
Yeah. So yeah, let's just talk about those two concepts. And certainly I'm using them, although the system that I bring organize them in a slightly different way, but let's just talk about them in general. Okay. So there's the concept of energy in physics. That's basically the capacity to do work. It's sort of, there's kinetic energy, which is actual movement, potential energy, which is potential movement. Some people think about energy as sort of the most fundamental thing. In other words, matter and time, space kind of emerge out of energy. So virtually everything you see can be thought of as different kinds of energy. So that's a cool, I like to call it the ultimate common denominator. Now, some physicists really like that. Other physicists don't like that. We can, if they're technical questions, I'd be happy to dialogue with how to think about that. But I really think we should embrace sort of a foundation energy information view of the universe. It transcends a matter, space-time mechanistic view. And I think it's most in accordance with what we know in terms of physics. So there's that. Now let's talk about what wisdom is. Wisdom, you kind of want to, I would want to define it. I think it's useful to break wisdom up into Frenesis and Sophia. This is certainly what Aristotle, this goes right back to Aristotle. Frenesis is the everyday sort of knowing how to be wise in context. It's your pragmatic living. And this is this capacity to discern what's relevant, to use some of John's language, and to realize adaptive paths in context, okay? And to do that, you have to be on the ground in context, and that's very much idiosyncratic to whatever situation you find yourself in, and the capacity to discern what are the important variables there. Certainly there are generalizable things to say, but generally that's placed in a particular context. Then Sophia, and really is philosophy, is sort of like love of wisdom. And that's fundamentally the kind of the understanding of what wisdom is and gathering knowledge to afford us wise ways of being in the world. So it's the project of philosophy very much. It's more of the intellectual architecture. And And certainly, essentially what I experienced is sort of, I built an intellectual architecture that then afforded me a placement that my soul really liked. It felt in right relation. So that was what I was just describing. If you ask sort of academics, basically what wisdom is, actually John helped convene a conference on wisdom not too long ago. And the consensus statement on wisdom is basically the capacity to act in valued ways of being, the capacity to reflect on what those values are and bring them in accordance. So there's sort of a meta-reflective capacity on what values are, taking that seriously, and then the capacity to embody that in adaptive, effective, rational ways is essentially the definition. So what, in a general way, wisdom then is understanding what's valued, and having some frame of that, and then understanding how to enact that. Energy is this capacity to do work. And essentially what I was then channeling was channeling the capacity to do work in this direction to realize embodied wisdom. So I'm channeling workable energy in the direction of metabolizing it so that a wise process unfolds.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, and you answered some of my questions I was going to ask. I have some more, but Evan, I know Evan Mullen has a question, so I'll take him in. And if anyone else has any questions, just
please,
put them in the chat now.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks. So if I recall correctly, you and John and Jordan and the sort of dialogue or trialogue that you had about wisdom energy, I believe it was John brought up obviously the connection to the concept of chi, which you've mentioned briefly here. And so I wonder, so within the sort of systems where the word chi is used, so for example, Taoist internal alchemy, right? There's a sort of tripartite separation of things that all you might want to translate as energies. So there's Jing, which is essence, which is associated with like sexual energy, Qi, which is associated with like breath or just life force energy at a sort of higher or more rarefied level, and then finally Shen, right, which is associated with mind, spirit, wisdom, right? So I'm wondering if this is a sort of correct mapping. So would it be correct to say that what you're speaking of as wisdom energy is essentially the thing that the Taoists would speak of as Shen, which is the ultimate result of a cultivation process of transforming Jing into Qi and Qi into Shen?
I think that's a really good summary. So I'm not super well versed in Taoism, but I know that organization, and I'll speak to the way I organize it from my own process that is an integrative view of psychology, psychotherapy into like, it has some Platonic and Aristotelian resonance. So for me, prior to wisdom energy, I had my basic sort of wise psychological mindfulness stance, which can be framed by calm bomb. Okay. And the bomb basically is the vertical organization of the psyche. B starts at the body and the bottom. Okay. So the bottom basically is your loins and your gut. So pretty core animalistic, and also then would orient towards pleasure and pain, orient towards somaticism, orient towards histories of trauma, sort of core pleasure pain dynamics there. Okay. So that's sort of most base energy, as it were, life force kinds of issues. Then you move up to your heart. Okay. The heart is your primate relational structure, your socio-emotional passive. I map this through what's called the influence matrix, and this is your sense of relational value, your sense of attachment. If you listen to polyvagal nerve people, they'll talk about, hey, your social openness or defensiveness. You immediately track a room and you get, boom, the heart system gets activated in relationship to threat. Or if you fall in love or you're seen and you're known and valued, it feels you fill my soul. So B, H, and then mind. Although in my system, it's really technically mind 3, you're justifying, rational, narrating, egoic, sense-making system that's propositionally grounded in how you think and manipulate ideas in your head and justify what's good and bad. That's mind. And then finally, your spirit, your existential valued structure organization. In a simplistic way, I'd say how you're going to try to be a good ancestor, meaning how you look beyond the ego, how you think about yourself. So body, heart, mind, spirit. Okay. The coherent integration, yes, it's a very much got a chakra, definitely. The coherent integration across those systems is crucial. The battle between those systems is a lot of what I see in psychotherapy, neuroticism across Calm refers to a metacognitive sage. The calm MO is then the attitude you bring to these different levels of body, heart, mind, and spirit. You take a calm metacognitive perspective of a sage. That's calm MO, and then it's cultivating an attitude of curiosity, acceptance, loving compassion, and motivated toward valued states of being. So essentially, the stance then is about, at least in terms of the internal vertical stance of integration, is integrate the effective, coherent, curious, accepting, loving, motivated integration of body, heart, mind, and spirit. And that would set up the process by which you would have the capacity to metabolize energy and orient towards wisdom. I think that overlaps a lot with what you were suggesting.
Yeah, very, very cool. I'm just trying to establish a sort of like ability to relate to this. And I've done Qigong for a really long time, internal alchemy. And so it feels very similar as far as a practice of sort of the successive transformation and refinement of essence to energy to spirit, mind, wisdom. There seems to be a really strong mapping there. So I want to, if a follow-up is possible, take a slight detour into ancient Western philosophy rather than Eastern, and look at, so you mentioned Frenesis, right? And, you know, I tend to use in my work the term metis, which philosophers prior to Plato and Socrates used to mean basically the same thing, like Parmenides and Empedocles use it in this sense. And so this has, of course, basically the same connotations as the word Frenesis would later take on. There's a sort of succession thing going on. And so my question here is relating to, I guess, the dynamic interplay of the cultivation of Frenesis / metis and then Sophia, right? And so that's something that I have a pretty intuitive understanding of, but I'm just hoping to hear a little bit more specific explication of how you see the sort of cycle of developing practical wisdom into the more pure spiritual or mind-oriented wisdom and the feedback and feed-forward dynamics there.
Totally. Let me share, but like kind of my relationship between those concepts in terms of my professional development and what drove this, and then we'll come back to that. So for me, Frenesis is the basically, all of this whole journey starts with what I call the problem of psychotherapy. So the problem of psychotherapy is I'm getting trained to be a psychological doctor. Okay, I get dropped into that, and I want the best coherent, most coherent, comprehensible, clear system. And that really what I want is a system of Sophia so that I can then cultivate Frenesis in my clients. Okay. And so then to be a good psychological doctor, that's what I felt like I needed. I was socialized to believe that empirical science would afford me that, basically, by academic science, psychology in America. And then I got to the psychotherapy world and I realized that's crap. I mean, that's like bad, not even in the fucking ballpark of up to the task. And then there's many aspects of why that's a nightmare problem. But anyway, I essentially, you know, the journey was, hey, I need a coherent system. I then asked if the science of psychology could give it to me. I asked that naively thinking it might, then I realized it can. And then I ultimately built a system that I think does. But the point of it is that, hey, if I'm going to be a sage, you know, it put in the psychological doctor sage chair, I need a Sophia system that I can then be brought to bear to cultivate insight in people so that they can expand their awareness and make good basic Frenesis choices in their embodied living in the world that they need to engage in. That's what we all need to do at some level. And indeed, psychotherapy, much of what psychotherapy is about is the maladaptive traps that life gets people in so they behave pretty unwisely or maladaptively. That's what we're trying to, and we want to try to cultivate that. I think people will vary tremendously in terms of how much they themselves are oriented towards Sophia. You know, I mean, many people are not necessarily oriented towards the cultivation of the life of the mind. And that's totally fine. Everyone, if you're not oriented to some Frenesis, you're going to live unwisely and you're going to get yourself stuck and you're probably going to suffer and engage in dysfunction. So I think it varies tremendously about, I wish that our society understood how to educate around Sophia and educate Sophia to foster the cultivation of wise living in the life world, life quest that each of us has. I don't see us doing that very well. I think that's all part of the crisis of education.
Cool. Thank you, Evan. Stephen Jenkinson is our philosopher in residence for this month, and you wrote a book called Die Wise. And Mark has a question related to some of his thoughts. So I'll take Mark again.
Thanks, Greg, for your comments. I'll be honest, it's tough for me to follow all of the concepts that you're forward, but I still struggle with it, but that's okay. When I was reading Die Wise by Stephen Jenkinson, I was struck by the repeated references in that book to the notion of skill, in contrast to knowledge. And so when I think of the system that you've put together, seems to me that wisdom has to it some element of skill. You use the term Frenesis, wondering if that's skill. And so maybe you can unpack to the, how skill would apply to in your system, and particularly the skill of human living, because it seems to me that the skill of human living includes that sense-making capacity, that awareness of who you are in a moment in time, and but also the skill of what you want to create through your actions, and when you want to be best to bring compassion and gratitude and forgiveness and mercy and patience to bear on building relationships. So yeah, a longer question than I thought, but there you go.
Yeah, no, it's a crucial question. In fact, that is the way I would hear that. I would immediately draw the parallel with how I open with Frenesis. So I think about Frenesis as essentially being, wise, practical action in context, and having the ability to discern what's relevant and the skill to carry it forward to get your adaptive outcomes. And of course, that's you have a perceptual ability to see what's relevant, and then you have to have a procedural and participatory abilities to to make that happen. In psychotherapy all the time, we're cultivating insight on some of the occasions, but not, and that's sort of more the psychodynamic angle, but then there's the whole much of behavioral psychotherapy really fundamentally is about skill development. It's like, do you know the actual procedures, when to apply them at the right time? I think there's a quote that opens an emotion focus book that says, it's easy to be angry, or whatever, but actually what's really hard is how to be angry to the right amount with the right person at the right time and be channeled in the right direction. So in terms of emotion, then we look at somebody and say, hey, what's their emotional functioning? Do they know what this is? Do they have some knowledge about what anger is? Do they understand then how to utilize that to orient? Do they have available in their repertoire of communication? Very basic, I statements. Why are you such a bitch? Okay. Why are you such a bitch is not a good communication strategy for spouses, right? Okay. I've worked with people who basically have that available to themselves to express anger. If you have that available to express anger as your primary tool to communicate, the response of that is going to be defensive, hostile, and angry. And then usually you get an engendered response of not very adept communication that fosters cumulative growth towards valued states of being. Instead, you get complete decompensation. Well, part of that is the problem of competence and skill. And so sometimes you want to divide that up into, well, there's the procedures that people need to learn, there's principles, there's processes that they need to engage in. But absolutely, wise living requires grace and skill and competence. And many people will have raw knowledge and not be able to engender grace and skill and competence in the appropriate moment. So it's definitely different concepts there.
Any follow-up, Mark?
No, just a thank you. That's very well put and helpful. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Joseph, you're up.
Yeah, thanks, Greg, for being here.
Absolutely.
So a kind of a recurring question for me in my life is the figure of the serpent. And I noticed you have the garden and the tree of knowledge. And I'm wondering, how does the serpent show up in your system? I don't know, maybe like the primate person, that joint point in your system. And yeah, I think for me, the question is like the serpent as this accuser figure that's associated with like neurotic self-consciousness.
Totally.
And how does that relate to wisdom energy and the pursuit of wisdom?
Beautiful. Yeah, I often like to say, the serpent's behind the garden. And what I mean by that is, again, sort of by virtue of the birth of this thing being born in psychotherapy, where you really are, as a psychological doctor, you're dealing with the depths of suffering. I worked with individuals, for example, for 4 years. I was at the University of Pennsylvania, and everybody had come in making a suicide attempt. That's what you needed in order to get into. I worked with 180 of those folks. So that's a lot. And you see a lot of suffering if you go to an inner city context, or you go to a very rural context in particular. You can see it certainly everywhere, but in terms of the regularity of human suffering and the presence of the serpent in relationship to the egoic and nasty ecology and intergenerational trauma and the evilness of the world that is easy to find ourselves in. I mean, it's very hard to find ourselves. You can decompensate into that spot pretty easily. And we may be finding that out large scale. I'm a little worried. But the bottom line is that, yeah, for me, it's very present. I built a system, a path out of that darkness, because that's what ideally what a psychological doctor tries to do. But it's not because I'm naive in relationship to its absence. Okay, the system itself is a particular pathway in relationship to both our mythos, obviously, tree of knowledge, garden. I'm drawing clearly on our shared Judeo-Christian narratives about potential and metaphor along those lines. It's to me, given my history along those lines, it's a given that people suffer, and that people have selfishness, that other people are resentment, that there's hate, that there's rage, that there's fundamental. When we get wounded and fearful, we want to destroy that which injured us in particular ways. That can be turned towards others. It can be turned towards our own heart. That's pretty omnipresent in my field. And so because it's omnipresent, it's sort of like, what's the path out of that? But I want everybody certainly to be clear that, yes, to me, that's sort of a given. That's part of our, we can fall and have fallen in many ways. And really, this is sort of a path sort of out of that, but it's not ignoring that by any stretch.
Any follow-up, Joseph?
Yeah, I think there's when you were going through the Elusive I series, this question, like in drawing the picture, like phylogenetically of the emergence of the self, I was wondering, almost in like, I was looking for like systems terminology for what is that. Like, what happens with that serpent figure? Like, what is it that shifts in the phylogenetic unfolding with the when the serpent shows up in the garden, for lack of a better way of putting that?
Yeah, well, I mean, to me, the way I interpret, actually, I think this is very close to Jordan Peterson's interpretation too. For me, the transition from primate to person emerges with the capacity for propositional language, which in turn engenders what's called the problem of justification. Okay, the problem. So if I start making propositions, then that introduces positive truth space. Hey, the antelope are over there. Okay, positive truth space can then be challenged with questions that open up alternatives. No, they're not over there. There's a gazelle. We should hunt rabbit. Okay, and the actual challenge of human communication, both its unbelievable potential that causes us, and I think it's fair to say, rise above the animal, okay, but also creates all sorts of different challenges, this issue of justification, okay, And then I would say that how we justify ourselves, all right, and the kinds of justification systems we build is represented by sort of the challenge of the garden. It's sort of like, hey, the metaphor is, okay, you're living like animals, okay? And at some level that's paradise, although it's also debatable. And then all of a sudden you get the capacity to have access to the tree of knowledge. It's like, but be careful. You start asking these types of questions and the shit's going to hit the fan, because all of a sudden you're like, you're not going to be able to answer them. Okay. Or you're going to realize where you are. You're going to realize you're going to die. You're going to realize that you're naked. You're going to realize that you're a talking ape. This is a scary ass thing. And if you then get really defensive, then you will justify and lie and deceive. Okay. So eating off the tree of knowledge is a dangerous thing. It's dangerous to wake up. So the serpent and the tree of knowledge is deeply connected to us capacity to wondering, hey, what is real? Hey, how do you know God? What gives you the right to tell me what to do? You know, so I'm going to be defiant. It opens up a huge number of potentials. I think it's crucial to incumbent upon us to realize our primate natures prior to this both have the capacity for beauty, love, and goodness. I think we're one of the most pro-social creatures ever, okay, in terms of our potential to be loving. There's a book back there called Humanity that came out, Humankind. It shows really, hey, we should really be grounded in our personality. We're also evil in our potential, okay? Not in our essence, but in our potential. If we get defensive and if our egoic justification gets rigid and we try to control people out of, and we're threatened by them in a particular way, we will destroy, you know, and we will other others and we will destroy. And we have that as a very available part of our nature. So the system basically says, yes, this issue of justification is a game changer. It opens up all sorts of potential. Some of those could be nightmares. Some of those could be beautiful. And then the idea is if we eat off of the tree of knowledge in the right way, in the 21st century, we can reconstitute the garden. That's the whole metaphor. It's like, oh, if we actually understand what science tells us about our nature and we metabolize that in a wise way, we can reconstitute ourselves in a sustainable, healthy, value-oriented way. That's a potential, and that's what the hope of the vision is.
Cool. Thank you, Joseph. You know, another question is coming up for me. So at the University of Waterloo, which is like an hour or so away from Toronto, they have a wisdom and culture lab. They talk about something called situated wise reasoning. And there's three ingredients: epistemic humility, accounting for context, and integrating different perspectives. And accounting for context, Frenesis, integrating different perspectives, Sophia. But to double click on the first one, epistemic humility, aporia, you know, what Socrates says, you know, like what grounds himself in, the only thing he knows is knows nothing. When I get into that state, it's almost like what Alex Ebert calls like a vesselhood, like kind of like that demonic energy channels through, and it feels like a reset. It feels like maybe what you were describing as wisdom energy. So I'm curious, where does that fall into epistemic humility? Because it can disrupt everything, but also could, like, you know, reset potentially to this wisdom energy.
Totally. Right. So from my vantage point, we have to be very, very cautious about any fundamentalism. Okay. Fundamentalism is, oh, this is true and this is always going to be true. And we know that this is true. Okay. I'm basically agnostic about the ultimate nature of reality. I challenge anybody to claim gnosis about that. And if you start with that point, you embrace, you're always then in a position of epistemic humility. I would argue that science and Socrates, both, if you listen to them correctly, orient us towards, you know, we don't know much, okay? So from my vantage point, there is a constant balance between a healthy skepticism and a healthy flexibility and a proper humility. You're a talking primate, by the way. You know, it's like, that is something we do know. And that's not going to put you in a particular space generally to afford the capacity to comprehend the cosmos. So I certainly think that I've certainly internalized a skeptic of my own stuff. I'd be happy to dialogue about, well, you know, this is why this stuff, you shouldn't take it super seriously. My frame, I can come off as somewhat confident about it. I do say, well, relative to other frames, it's pretty damn good. But it's not the absolute capital T truth. So to me, if you start with that position, and it's an honest position. I think that from that falls a lot of epistemic humility, and it orients you to say, wait a minute, if you don't think that you have the truth, you're always like, well, wait a minute, what's another possibility? And as long as you don't get gullible or too loose and fall into, massive skepticism, I don't think that's a grounding that's useful either, but it maintains flexibility, growth, opportunity for self-correction, and not a commitment to fundamentalism. That's how I would orient around epistemic humility.
Awesome. Brendan, you had a question.
Yes.
Hey, Brandon.
Hey. So and this is something you were messaging me about a few days ago. I haven't written back because I had to really study a lot of this stuff. It's really complicated. But John Vervaeke saying that the coin is a talisman for transformation, and there's 4 on one of the sides. You have quadrants. Those are not the same as the Wilberian quadrants, but they're the 4, I guess, forms of knowing: subjective, intersubjective, objective, and transjective. And I think that I figure then this has a potential for not only inner transformation, which you guys are focused on primarily, but it could extend into social transformation, since that's the transjective as well. Could you elaborate on that, maybe, if I'm on?
Sure. I mean, right. I don't draw a huge distinction between individual and social. I mean, we need lots of transformation, and I don't like, I don't think either or terms. I'll speak to myself. I actually have not renewed my clinical license this year because I'm shifting my identity more in terms of sort of a philosopher, meta-psychologist, public intellectual in a different way. And I really do think that the time is now oriented towards a collective transformation rather than one person at a time in a confidential room, and engaged. And I want to bring that wisdom out. I think there's a lot of wisdom from the therapy room, but I think it's a lot better if it's situated in the culture and in the collective. And so I'm very keen on a large scale transformation in our systems of justification and in our ecologies of practice and ways of being. And I think that if we can afford that, the kind of meaning and mental health that people are engaged in right now can qualitatively shift towards the better. Yeah, you mentioned in terms of the coin, I do embrace, a sort of a 4-part epistemology, as it were, or I certainly embrace perspectives from phenomenological, subjective, justification, intersubjective, and scientific objective, and then place that in what John would call a transjective participatory. That affords a multiple integrated perspective across a wide variety of different modes. And the bottom line is, I've drawn my other good friend, Zach Stein, to say, actually, there's a crisis of education. What we really need to be thinking fundamentally about is about how to get that we can build much better coherent knowledge systems that organize both what we know and orient what is toward the ought. And then if you were socialized in those systems, at least that's the argument, we would be in a much better place. So for me, the goal is to get synced up, build knowledge systems, and then build educators and other community leaders and political activists that can see, hey, if this was our operating system, both in terms of how we understood the world and how we engendered certain kinds of practices, the world would be a better place. Now we got to distill it. So you get an egghead like me and all the weird language I use, you get somebody actually, talks real person language, and then you translate that in and you get the message to folks. So my hope is that we will network together and shift towards a new enlightenment. And I know that you hope that also, Brandon.
Any follow-up, Brandon?
No, not really. This kind of came out of a discussion that I was having with Gregg, where I was trying to find someone who is really familiar with his system that could provide this other side of the enlightenment gap that he's talking about, which is the extension into the society, and that we're still trying to find, proper grounding in Gregg's system, and then extend that into the social sciences somehow. And I was just doing a little assistance with him on that, because he admitted, Gregg said, he's not really super focused on the social sciences. So that's something we're just exploring, and that is part of the Enlightenment 2.0 system, or that goal, one of his main projects, So if anybody has any ideas on that, you can contact me. I'm just trying to do a little assistance for Gregg's Enlightenment project.
Yeah, no, in a nutshell, the unified theory builds basically a base up to the social sciences, meaning that it grounds basic animal psychology into human psychology, and really affords a clear bridge into what's called cultural anthropology as a base of the social sciences. What the tree of knowledge and unified theory does not attend a huge amount to is the evolution of technology. Modern society is best understood as from a combination of culture and technology that then organizes our practices in a biophysical ecology. So the main social sciences have to take into consideration how institutions work, how societies assemble themselves, how economics operates, how governance structures emerge. So there is a real intellectual gap that would be, at least according from a unified theory perspective, if you could merge what the unified theory of psychology, how it frames psychology in a particular way, with the classic social sciences, sociology, anthropology, economics, political science, and then have people lensing technology, bringing that to bear, that'd be great. And that's in particularly crucial for us at the level of the fifth joint point. The fifth joint point is always this intersection that we actually now face, where we built artificial intelligence systems and computational systems that are immediately interfacing with all of our communication networking systems. And so the entire world, the fifth joint point is the entire world's in a transformation. So we need lots of efforts, both at the intellectual understanding, and from my vantage point, it's like, wait a minute, how do we actually get lived, embodied, philosophical, wise systems around? And that's really my primary tension with the coin and garden, is to see whether I can transform this into some sort of relatable system, or at least maybe through other people who can see how to do that, and then get it to folks that could actually use it in an everyday world.
Awesome. Thanks, Brandon. Let's sneak in maybe two more questions. Deljeet, you had a question or a share.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Thanks, Gregg, for yet another model. Adding to my model-philia, my mapophilia, right? And I'm always trying to integrate with other maps too. So It's like I immediately started thinking about something that's on my mind a lot, is Gebser's model, right? Yep. And the aperspectival, because you use the word perspective and perspectival. And I'm wondering if this state you got allowed you to move into that integral aperspectival space, because when I see these metaphors too, it's like the coin feels very mental rational, where the tree feels very, as you said, mythical, and maybe the garden is somewhat magical, or it's giving us access to that level, all latent and now integrating. And then you just added technology too. And I think for me, when I think Gebser and McLuhan overlap so much, I think there's some real integration of those two thinkers. So I'm not sure where the question is here, but I'm just wondering if that resonates topologically with what you're getting at.
Well, certainly I'm not a Gebser scholar, but I certainly am very well versed in integral. And of course, Ken takes off some of that. But if we talk about the evolution of cultural consciousness, really Gebser's trailing a particular kind of evolution of cultural consciousness. And the unified theory would afford a particular vision on that. It adds this view that actually the propositional side is structurally functionally organized as systems of justification. And those things will evolve over time. And that propositional network will create a relationship with practice and perspectival knowing. And what Gebser is trailing is he's affording us a particular way to understand that kind of evolution with a lot of brilliance and depth. I think that he also then sets the stage for us, and this is the unified theory also says this, and integral says this in particular ways, is that there is an opportunity to include and transcend the various places, and see the strengths of each of them, and afford access to aspects of our psyche through those strengths. And I embrace an integrated pluralistic philosophy, which is basically, hey, take the good, weak versions of all the various ideas. Good, weak meaning, the academic advancer will be like, hey, this is like what I do with Beck or whatever. Beck's like, hey, cognitive therapy is everything. And that's fine. But it's really the weak version of cognitive therapy is very powerful, not the extreme version, especially when it gets defined against other perspectives. So I think a particular kind of cultural sensibility affords a capacity to pull weak versions of ideas together. If you have a good map, you can coherently interrelate them. I think Gebser points to our capacity to do that. I think Integral points to our capacity to do that. I wish I knew more about Gebser, but that's my snapshot response.
Any follow-up?
Yeah, I guess it's more of I'm grappling with how to get to a perspectival. It seems like a really difficult move. And it's like, I'm looking for examples or praxis that gets me there and shows me that way. So it's like, I think what I'm getting from you, it's almost like, is multi-perspectival, even from these more weaker perspectives, but mapped connectedly, is that a good step towards this a perspectival, which is not, hierarchical either. And he's getting to something other than Wilbur in a way. It's not transcend and include, but just it's the latency thing is a real fascinating thing with his thinking.
I need to learn more about that, but I will say that absolutely the phenomenological experience of the wisdom energy state that I was in was a dissipation of perspectival. Okay, so that it was definitely, I definitely felt that unified oneness. Like I was in my cells, I was out my cells, I was in the particular, it's basically, there was a oneness with the energy information across wide variety of different domains. I literally felt like I was seeing the world through the eyes of my dog in particular ways. There was the normal framing of a spectralized, epistemological portal of the consciousness of, hey, here's how I see it. That was definitely loosened and expanded in a big way. I forgot to answer that part of your question. So.
Awesome. Thanks, Delji. Perhaps Evan's question, which I really like, about practice towards wisdom energy. Would you like to ask it, Evan?
Yeah, so I'm thinking of a question people ask a lot in these kinds of contexts, which is, okay, assume that I don't have a practice that feels like it works to cultivate wisdom energy. You've done a lot of research. You've got a very clear perspective on this. What would your best recommendation for somebody who doesn't currently have a praxis and wants to have one that you think would give them a good chance of being able to cultivate wisdom energy?
Great. Yeah. So the consolidated principles that I started today with in terms of calm bomb, okay, is a start. And so what that basically means is, hey, map yourself a particular way, okay, and recognize that your consciousness goes down into your body. There's a heart, there's a justifying mind, and there's a existential value structure, okay. So one way to map yourself is to be attentive to that. If you want, in terms of there are a lot of potentially useful models in relationship to how to get in touch with that. John Vervaeke did a free, which I went through the lessons on. John Vervaeke did a 3 meditative practice, which people are probably aware of, where I think for 45 days, he walked people through a meditative mindfulness informed by cognitive science. That basically orients your perspectival knower, to ground your attention in your body and expand, and then cultivate attitudes that are very similar to what I would embrace with Calm MO. So it then says you want to be grounded and centered, and then you want to adopt the position of the sage and cultivate a sense of curiosity, a sense of acceptance, a sense of loving compassion, and motivated toward valued states of being. That's the principle. To do Frenesis, that's why psychotherapy takes, 16 sessions with one person, hour at a time. I mean, to cultivate where somebody is and what their issues are in relation is, of course, not amenable to a 2-minute response. But that's the basic principle. And certainly I can point you to John's thing. And there would be others that I could gain if I just did a little bit of study. The mindful path to self-compassion, if you're worried about self-criticism, by Gerner, The Mindful Path to Self-Compassion, is a self-help book that I think does a good job that's very similar to what CalmMO teaches individuals. So if you're looking for a bibliotherapy, that's another. The last thing I'll say is if you have deal with depression, I did a blog series on what to do if you're depressed. It's a 15-part blog series that guides an individual about what depression is, how to identify it in yourself, how to reference your well-being, how to orient towards a healthier, active lifestyle, etc.
Do you have a follow-up, Evan?
Yeah, no, thank you. And so yeah, what I'm imagining being in this position, and I'm saying, so okay, so Vervaeke's Mindfulness Informed by Cognitive Science series would be really good recommendation for people. The other books you mentioned feel like really good recommendations. More a comment. I want to throw in a recommendation for Peter Ralston's book Zen Body Being, as really good to work on the connection with that embodied layer, but from a perspective of wisdom. But I really like the answer, and you gave a concrete starting point, so I really appreciate that.
Beautiful. And if anyone has any practices that they use that think they lead to wisdom energy, put them in the chat right now so we can use the collective wisdom here at the Stoa. So we're reaching the top of the hour, Gregg. Any kind of words you'd like to leave us with, or anything that came alive for you today?
Well, I mean, I really appreciate great questions. I mean, I think that for me, the real basis framing is like, okay, how do we understand what is? And then how do we orient towards what ought to be? And then when you catch yourself in those moments, those would be examples of aligned wisdom energy, where the energy of is then oriented towards the wisdom of ought. And look for, think about who might embody that. I certainly think that we need ideas about, I was asking my wife just yesterday, like, yeah, who do you admire the most, and who would you put to orient yourself in terms of the way you want to be? We just had that conversation just yesterday. So for me, that orienting structure then allows that opportunity, at least it starts the process of creating a logos, and also know that the Frenesis is always contextual. You need epistemic humility. And so there's never any easy answer for all specific things because that's always contextual, but these are principles that can guide folks.
Awesome. It reminds me of the Stoic sage, someone you look up to for wisdom. Yep. So thank you for being one of the Stoa's sages, Gregg, for once again at the Stoa. Love to have you back. And to make some closing announcements of upcoming events. Tomorrow we have the final session of Doomer Optimism with Jason Snyder and Ashley Colby. They're launching their own podcast. So they're going to just close off here at the Stoa, which is going to be awesome. And Bernardo Kastrup is coming to the Stoa for a session called The Daemon Knows. That's on September 20th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, which is going to be a really fun session. So that being said, Gregg, everyone, thank you so much for coming to the Stoa today.
All right. Thank you. Deeply appreciate it. Thanks, guys. Thanks. Really enjoyed it.